This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
What up, y'all? It's Joe Budden, here to talk about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to win real money while watching football. You can get up to 100 times your money.
Prize Picks will give you $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Just download the Prize Picks app and use code SPOTIFY. That's code SPOTIFY on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play a $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pala, and I welcome you to a new episode of Dpen Crimes. Today, we're diving into what matters most to me, the various possible reconstructions. In other words, we'll step into the minds of the key players, everyone except Meredith, because clearly she is the real unfortunate protagonist of this sad case. But we'll put ourselves in the shoes of Rudy Guede, Amanda Knox, and Raffaele Sollecito. We'll also try to imagine the thoughts of Giampiero Menini and all the judges who convicted and acquitted, trying to understand why certain decisions were made, and above all, what really might have happened that night. So that's what we'll attempt to do in this episode and the next. First, we'll outline the different reconstructions, and then we'll look at the strengths and weaknesses of each one. Each reconstruction has its critical points, and our goal will be to eliminate, refine, and discuss them together. In the previous episode, we examined the judicial process of the case, from the initial conviction all the way to the fifth appeal, which ended in acquittal. The final ruling led to a highly controversial verdict, in which Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were acquitted, generating divided opinions. While Knox and Sollecito welcomed the verdict with satisfaction, Rudy Guede, involved in a parallel trial not included in this verdict, expressed his dissatisfaction, even in an interview with Franca Leosini on Story Maldet. So, what does the latest ruling say? It states that due to serious errors and misconduct by the investigators, who mishandled evidence, contaminated the crime scene, and made other serious mistakes, there isn't enough evidence to incriminate Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito. That's the short version, but it also adds that Amanda Knox was indeed in that house, according to her own confession. We've already discussed how she came to this confession. Knox places herself in that house. As for Sollecito, it's suggested that it's highly likely he was there too, since his alibis aren't precise, and he was always with Knox. So it's a ruling that leaves a bitter taste, and I fundamentally disagree with it. Why? Well, let's continue with the various reconstructions. From my perspective, it's clear that if anyone besides Rudy Guede was in that house, they either participated in the crime or committed it themselves. They weren't there by chance. I find it hard to imagine that Guede tried to rape, robbed, stabbed the poor Meredith Kercher 40 times and caused a tremendous amount of chaos while the other two just stood by and did nothing. According to Knox's version, she and Sollecito were at his place watching TV. Neither of them calls the police. There's no trace of them at the crime scene, yet they come back and clean it up. Frankly, that seems like a hard reconstruction to believe. In fact, anyone observing this case with a critical eye might think that they were acquitted for political and international reasons. Amanda Knox is American, and there were pressures to acquit her, even though they might be guilty since they are placed in that house, at the crime scene. In my view, this ruling does not do justice to Meredith Kercher and leaves many questions unresolved. It's unclear who was responsible for her murder since Rudy Guede has been identified as the only perpetrator, but it doesn't specify that the other defendants, Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito, were acquitted because they didn't commit the crime. The situation is further complicated because Knox and Sollecito were not incarcerated. Extradition from the United States wasn't possible since US law states that once acquitted, you cannot be convicted again for the same crime. Amanda Knox has rebuilt her life in the US, while Raffaele Sollecito is Italian. So why isn't he convicted? In summary, this ruling has created a situation that, in my opinion, satisfies no one. With that introduction, let's get started. Let's start with the first reconstruction, which led to the initial conviction. Imagine the scene as it was laid out in the ruling. Rudy Guede, Amanda Knox, and Raffaele Sollecito are together in Piazza Grimana in Perugia, a place familiar to them. The three of them are moving stealthily, trying not to be seen or heard by anyone. They arrive at the house, where Meredith Kercher is not present at the moment. Inside the apartment, they spend time smoking marijuana and drinking, with no sexual activity happening between them initially. At one point, Rudy Guede goes to the bathroom, leaving Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito alone. While Rudy is in the bathroom, Amanda and Raffaele start to fool around. When Rudy finishes, he comes out of the bathroom without flushing the toilet, though we don't know why. And, excited by the scene he sees between Amanda and Raffaele, he decides to go after the housemate, Meredith, who has now returned. It's said she gets home around 9 or 9:30 p.m. In a moment of emotional impulse, a surge of sexual desire, Rudy decides to launch himself at Meredith with the intention of raping her. According to this version, Amanda and Raffaele feel disturbed by the situation, as if the scene is interrupting their moment. Something like, "Leave us alone, don't interfere." And they decide to hold Meredith back to give Rudy a clear path. However, instead of assaulting her, Rudy chooses to stab her. Clearly, I'm being ironic in describing this absurd story because this reconstruction has flaws everywhere. According to this version, Amanda and Raffaele get annoyed by the noises coming from Meredith's room. They realize she's come home and start to worry. When Meredith enters the room, Amanda supposedly stabs her in the neck, causing her immediate death. After the murder, the three of them flee the house in different directions. The next morning, or maybe even during the night, Amanda and Raffaele return to Meredith's house to clean up. They collect the blood and arrange the crime scene. Then they head back to Raffaele's house, and from there, the story we already know begins. Now, why do I think this reconstruction is weak? There are several valid reasons, and I find it outrageous that Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were convicted based on this version. It's true that in the initial trial, there are contradictory pieces of evidence. What are those pieces of evidence? We know for certain that Rudy Guede was there. He admits it himself. His DNA is all over the crime scene, his fingerprints, even his feces. Despite this, there's no coherent reconstruction that places him as the sole culprit. In this version, Guede is portrayed as an accomplice of Amanda and Raffaele, yet his role isn't clearly defined. His participation seems limited to having been there and getting excited because Amanda and Raffaele were fooling around. This reconstruction is very weak because it doesn't provide a convincing explanation of their involvement or clarify why anyone should be an accomplice to a murder. This makes the entire theory fragile and unbelievable. And here, I think, is the real weak point of this version. The relationships between the three alleged killers are very tenuous. Amanda and Raffaele had known each other for only 5 days. It's true that during those 5 days, they were always together, like a happy in-love couple, but in the end, it's just 5 days. Both were students away from home, which might have led them to spend a lot of time together during that time. However, even though I've never killed anyone, I don't think I would trust someone I barely knew for 5 days to commit a murder. Who guarantees that this person won't go to the police the next day? There isn't enough trust to carry out such a serious act. And what did the investigators try to do? They attempted to argue that Raffaele had very little experience with women up until that point. He was almost inexperienced in love, and this sudden relationship overwhelmed him during those 5 days. According to the investigators, Amanda, portrayed as a twisted and manipulative mind, influenced Raffaele to the point that she led him to participate in a murder. In all of this, there's Rudy Guede, who has never met Raffaele. The two have never seen each other. In fact, in none of the trials did one mention the other. What does this mean? It means that in all three levels of trial, neither Guede nor Sollecito referred to each other. Neither Rudy Guede nor Raffaele Sollecito has ever mentioned the other's name in court. When asked about each other, the response was always the same: "We've never met." As for the relationship between Rudy Guede and Amanda Knox, it was so superficial that it was limited to a simple hello. Both stated they had only spoken once, at a place where Amanda worked. With such a shallow relationship, it seems improbable that Rudy would have been invited to smoke marijuana at Amanda and Raffaele's place. There's no way to coherently and plausibly place all three together in the house. This, in my opinion, is the biggest discrepancy in this reconstruction. So why were they convicted? There are three key pieces of evidence, two of which are concrete and one circumstantial, on which the investigators based much of the case and the prosecution's theory.
Streaming only on Peacock.
Being with Finch felt like I was in some fairy tale.
She's like, I write for Grey's Anatomy. I was like, what?
Her writing was so highly regarded because Finch had been through so much.
A Hollywood writer's life.
When you love somebody, you'll ignore red flags so they're hitting you in the head.
Filled with fiction.
She would do whatever it takes to get ahead.
She saw her life like a TV series.
I don't know who my wife is.
Anatomy of Lies. Streaming October 15th, only on Peacock.
It was all a lie.
The first piece of evidence is that Rudy Guede was there, so in some way he was involved. That's clear. The second piece of evidence is the knife found at Raffaele's house, which had DNA from Meredith Kercher and Amanda Knox's fingerprints on it. And the third piece of evidence is that Raffaele and Amanda's behavior seemed strange from the very beginning. Amanda initially confessed to being there, but then retracted her statement. Raffaele changed his story, first saying he was with her and then denying it. Their alibis don't match, and there's a lack of a strong motive. So this scenario of a rape gone wrong was created to fit the pieces together. At first, it was argued that Rudy Guede was Amanda's drug dealer and that he went to the house to sell her drugs. Then, with Meredith's return, everything supposedly blew up. However, there's no concrete evidence that Rudy was actually her drug dealer, which weakens this theory a lot. I understand why they were convicted, even though I mentioned earlier that it seemed crazy to me. But I recognize that based on those three pieces of evidence, the conviction seemed reasonable at that time. The knife with Meredith and Amanda's DNA, the strange behaviors, the mismatched alibis, and Amanda and Raffaele's half-confessions, along with the confirmed presence of Rudy Guede, were the main pieces of evidence. However, today we know that this hypothesis has been dismantled. The knife is no longer considered the murder weapon. The suspicious behaviors of Amanda and Raffaele, while odd, aren't proof of guilt. This is the first reconstruction, and I'll repeat, it's a very weak one. I can understand why these theories were formulated since some evidence pointed in that direction. But in my opinion, the attempt to connect all that evidence isn't solid and leaves many loose ends. There are too many gaps and things that don't fit. Another point that doesn't make sense is Rudy Guede's behavior. Why didn't he tell the whole truth from the beginning, especially in the second trial? In the end, he now claims that it was Amanda and Raffaele, as he stated in an interview in 2016. But when they were convicted in the initial trial and then acquitted in the second, Rudy should have confessed everything and said, "Yes, I was there. This is what happened." However, he didn't do that. Why? Because that's not what happened. If it really had been that way, he would have had every incentive to speak up to reduce his sentence. Rudy received a 16-year sentence, while Amanda and Raffaele faced life in prison. At that moment, it suited him to remain silent. But when the others were released, if his version were true, he should have told the truth. Even so, he didn't, because that's not how it went down. This is the first reconstruction, and I'll repeat, it's very weak. In fact, from the comments I read from you, many agree. Pietro says it's a very weak reconstruction, and both Lucia and Alberto share that opinion. Of course, if you disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, let's move on to the reconstruction that Rudy offers, which differs a bit from the official version but includes some points that don't favour him. Rudy has provided his account of events since November 7th, 2007, the day he spoke with Giacomo on Skype, up until today. His version is consistent in some respects, but he changes certain important details from one statement to another. Let's revisit Rudy Guede's reconstruction, which I've mentioned before, but I want to analyze it in depth in this episode. Rudy says, "I arrived in front of the house because I was invited. The night before had been Halloween, an important party, especially among English and American university students. The last photo we have of Meredith shows her dressed as a vampire. We know for sure that Meredith attended a party. Rudy claims to have met Meredith at that place and that they shared the famous kiss. He talks about that kiss in his first Skype call with Giacomo and mentions it again in his last public interview with Franca Leosini in 2016. However, Meredith's friends deny that kiss ever happened. They confirm that they saw and talked to each other, but they assert that there was no kiss. Whether or not that kiss happened isn't the most important thing. What really matters is what Rudy says. Meredith gave me a date for the next day at around 8:30 at her house, at the villa on Via della Pergola, which he already knew because he had been to the apartment of the guys from the Marche region who lived downstairs. Let's move forward a few hours. Rudy leaves home much earlier because he has to meet a friend who had just returned from abroad, maybe from Berlin or Greece. I don't remember exactly. They meet up, go to eat a kebab. The famous kebab that, according to Rudy, didn't sit well with him. I want to emphasize that this is Rudy's version, just to make it clear for everyone. Rudy continues, "We leave, eat the kebab, and around 8, I check the time. Since Rudy is always late, and that day he doesn't have his mobile phones with him, Rudy Guede doesn't have his cell phone or his second mobile phone, the question arises, why not? 5 days earlier, Rudy was in Milan, and upon returning, he was stopped by the police for breaking into a daycare where he had spent the night with someone he knew. Although they initially detained him and confiscated his phones, they eventually let him go because he hadn't committed anything serious. However, his phones remained confiscated. This detail is crucial for understanding Rudy's version of events and how it fits, or doesn't fit, into the timeline of what happened that night. Returning to the reconstruction. According to Rudy Guede's version, he then heads to the house where Meredith Kercher, Amanda Knox, and the other Italian girls live. Although Rudy changes some details in his various versions, the central point remains the same. Once there, Meredith would already be home, although in some versions he says she had just arrived, while in others he doesn't mention it. The situation shifts slightly depending on which version you hear. However, according to the account of her friend Dolly Parton, who accompanied Meredith to the house, Meredith would have arrived around 8:30 p.m. Rudy recounts that upon entering the house, he encounters Meredith, and they start talking. At some point, according to Rudy's reconstruction, and I'll repeat it once again, Meredith goes to her room to put down her bag and begins to complain about Amanda Knox. Rudy claims that Meredith tells him Amanda has stolen money from her, stating she had 300 euros hidden in her drawer, under her underwear, intended for rent, and accuses Amanda of taking it. Meredith also criticizes Amanda, saying she spends too much money, is messy, dirty, and always leaves the place in shambles. Meredith adds, "When I get back, I have to talk to her." After this moment of complaints, Rudy describes how Meredith calms down, and they both return to the living room, where they start talking on the couch. From there, they begin to kiss and share a bit of intimacy. During this phase, the famous line that Rudy repeats in all his versions comes up. In the middle of kissing and touching, Meredith asks him, "Do you have a condom?" Rudy replies that he doesn't have one, and neither does Meredith, which makes them laugh. They then decide to get dressed again, and Rudy tells her he needs to go to the bathroom. Meredith points him to the large bathroom, the closest one to the living room. Rudy mentions in his interview with Franca Leosini that he is a very hygienic person, so he puts toilet paper on the toilet seat before sitting down. He says he spends about 1 or 2 minutes fixing the paper, and while he's doing that, he hears the doorbell ring. This is where Rudy's versions start to differ significantly. In his 2007 statement, Rudy claims that he heard the doorbell but didn't pay attention to it and continued adjusting the toilet paper, staying in the bathroom for about 5 or 6 minutes. In 2016, Rudy Guede introduces a significant change to his account of events. He claims that while he was in the bathroom, he recognized Amanda Knox's voice arguing with Meredith. According to Rudy, he was already aware there was some tension between them over money, so he didn't worry too much and decided to put on his headphones. He claims to have been in the bathroom for 10 to 11 minutes, based on having heard almost 3 complete songs. However, at one point, Rudy says he heard a very loud scream, a scream that exceeded the volume of the music. Since the music was loud, he asserts that the scream was extremely intense. He immediately gets up, puts on his underwear and pants, though he doesn't fasten them, and rushes out of the bathroom without flushing the toilet or caring about the feces he left behind. He heads toward the hallway, which explains the presence of his feces in the bathroom. In 2016, Rudy added a crucial detail. Initially, the living room lights were on, but then they went out. As he approached the door to Meredith Kercher's room, he saw a male figure. Rudy claims he bumped into this person, touched their shoulder, and asked, "What's going on?" According to Rudy, the man turned around with what he described as a small knife, something like a scalpel. Rudy recounts that this threatening figure approached him, and in his attempt to defend himself, his pants, which were still unbuttoned, caused him to fall to the ground. He describes that moment as one of great confusion and fear, explaining that he couldn't button his pants due to the chaos. Now, this is where we need to pause for a moment because Rudy presents 2 completely different versions. In the first version, told to Giacomo when he doesn't know he's being intercepted by the police, Rudy mentions only one assailant. According to him, when the assailant sees Rudy, who isn't alone in the house, he flees. This assailant runs down the hallway, passes through the living room, and escapes through the door. In 2016, in the last public statement we have from him, Rudy changes his account. He claims not to recognize Raffaele Sollecito because he doesn't know him and has never seen him. He describes a young man wearing a Napapidri sweatshirt and a cap, with brown hair. He mentions the brown hair from the very beginning, even to Giacomo on Skype. But in 2016, Rudy adds that while he was on the ground after falling, this guy said, come on, we've been discovered," and adds, "I apologize for the language, but we're staying true to the reconstruction. Black found, guilty found." He is on the ground and sees Amanda Knox and a man fleeing. Rudy then runs to Filomena Romanelli's room, which opens onto the patio, and from the window, he sees these 2 figures running away. Rudy continues his reconstruction, stating he recognizes Amanda Knox, while he doesn't know who the other person is, but later recognizes Raffaele Sollecito after seeing pictures. Pay attention, because the reconstruction doesn't end here. At that moment, Rudy is in Filomena Romanelli's room. After seeing Amanda and the man escape, he runs to Meredith's room, where he finds Meredith in a pool of blood. Rudy tries to stop the bleeding with his hands, but fails to control the hemorrhage. He then rushes to the second bathroom, which is right across from Meredith's room, and grabs a towel to stop the blood. The towel becomes saturated with blood in no time, so Rudy goes back to the bathroom and takes another towel. In the interview with Leocini, Rudy claims he used 2 towels to stop the bleeding. Although he says he was overwhelmed, the number of towels isn't a major issue, as both were found and were indeed used to stop the blood. In another interrogation and in the journal he kept while in prison, Rudy states that the blood was abundant and that he was shocked by the scene. He recounts that Meredith clutched him tightly, holding on to him and trying to tell him something with F, and attempted to write on the wall. There are marks on the wall, but they are strange and unclear. In fact, in the crime scene photos, there's no clear writing visible, but Rudy suggests that the AF message might have been directed at Raffaele. When Leocini asks Rudy why he didn't call emergency services if he was present at the crime scene, Rudy responds with a hint of bewilderment, explaining that at that moment he didn't think to do so. Now we need to ask ourselves whether Rudy Guede is a great actor or a man consumed by guilt. In the next episode, we'll dive deeper into this aspect. Rudy claims he was unable to do what even a 6-year-old would: call emergency services. He says he was so shocked and focused on what was happening that he wasn't thinking about fleeing, just about what he was witnessing. So, what happened? Rudy says, "I was covered in blood. I had a dead woman in my arms with whom I had talked and been intimate just 20 minutes before. I was afraid they would blame me entirely. I saw that I didn't have a cell phone, and this is crucial. So I ran away. First, I cleaned myself up a bit at home, changed clothes, and then I went to several clubs and places to be seen, to create a retroactive alibi. Finally, I went to Germany, where I was later arrested. I confess that for a long time, I believed this account because it seemed to make sense. Rudy Guede's reconstruction feels very human. I see him overwhelmed by guilt and panic. Also, I notice that many of you seem to agree with this perspective. It's a narrative in which he appears as the most unfortunate person in the world. He's with the girl, goes to the bathroom, and after spending 10 minutes in that situation, he discovers that total chaos has erupted. On one hand, it seems human for him to feel overwhelmed, and although he acknowledges his responsibility for not helping Meredith, he condemns his actions and accepts the 16-year prison sentence, but doesn't want to face additional time for having killed her. It might seem logical and rational to think that, at that moment, Rudy Guede should have called the ambulance, realizing that Meredith was dead. However, it's also possible that, given the confusion and panic, his perception of the situation was distorted. He might have thought that even though he was aware of the gravity of the situation, he could avoid taking direct responsibility for what happened. This mindset could explain why he decided to flee instead of seeking immediate help. I've listened to Leosini's interview at least 25 times. I'm not joking. I've examined every detail of his responses and interrogations. There are some passages I could recite from memory because Rudy Guede is the central figure in this story. What he says is far more interesting than what the other involved parties declare. The others could have been present, could lie, or tell the truth, but we can't know for sure. We know for certain that Rudy Guede was in the house, so his statements carry undeniable weight. He can't deny his presence, as he was found with his DNA and feces at the crime scene. Therefore, his words about being there are true and cannot be refuted. However, it's interesting to note that he had 6 days to prepare and refine his version of events before telling Giacomo, which raises some thoughts. After the initial shock, a more honest and immediate reaction might have been to go to the Carabinieri and clearly explain what had happened, even if he hadn't been directly involved in the murder. Instead, Rudy chose to flee, which raises questions about why he didn't immediately report to the authorities. Then there are issues with his version of events, some of which are minor but significant details. In all major crimes, the devil is in the details, and some details just don't match up. Here are the main problems, and I'll explain them. The change in the number of attackers. Rudy initially talks about a single attacker, but then he changes his story and mentions 2 attackers. This change is crucial because the presence of 2 attackers instead of 1 significantly alters the dynamics of the murder. In his first interrogation, Rudy clearly states that the attacker was a man and that Amanda Knox was not present. Changing this detail is devastating because you can say, you didn't eat kebab. You had McDonald's or a sandwich. It doesn't really matter. But Rudy changes a detail that's too important, one that plays a crucial role. If Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito had been completely out of the investigative picture at that time, and he had told them there were 2 attackers, one of whom was a woman, that would have made all the difference. But when he is arrested, and especially when he talks to Giacomo, Amanda and Raffaele are already in prison, and he has read the newspapers. So he knows there are 2 suspects, a man and a woman, and even knowing this, he still says, no, it was a man. In my opinion, this change from 1 attacker to 2 doesn't convince me much. But then there's another detail that might seem trivial, yet he has thought a lot about it. Let me explain. He claims that when he sits in the bathroom in 2016, he hears Amanda Knox talking, and they start fighting about money, using certain phrases. I thought, but Amanda and Meredith wouldn't have been speaking Italian to each other. They're both native English speakers. They would have spoken in English. How is it possible that he, who mentions a phrase, now I can't recall it exactly, but he repeats it precisely, would be able to do so, especially since I believe they would have spoken in English, particularly while arguing, which would have been in their native tongue? So these details begin to crumble a bit. I don't know. I take this theory with ups and downs. There are days when it seems to work quite well and days when it doesn't. For instance, it's puzzling why there are no traces of Raffaele and Amanda in the room where Meredith was murdered, even though there are clear traces of Rudy everywhere, but there isn't a single indication of Raffaele Sollecito, and that micro-DNA they found was allegedly contaminated. So if it really were them, we should find more biological material. But at this point, and to wrap this up, I want to propose a possible explanation that I've imagined, although it's not the one I find most likely. We'll discuss that in the next episode. What if it was a premeditated murder? Everyone says it all started with a fight, but what if it was actually planned out in detail? Imagine, they're at home, turning on the computer to create an alibi, then they run over to Via della Pergola. They go in, bundled up, wearing gloves, maybe even boots and masks. No, Rudy doesn't mention masks. He doesn't say they were disguised. But perhaps they wore something to prevent leaving biological traces, something to protect their hair from falling out, like the cap that Rudy says the first attacker was wearing. They go in, act quickly, and flee without leaving any traces. It's not entirely impossible. Maybe we don't have much evidence precisely because they didn't leave any footprints, not even in the blood. It's a somewhat forced hypothesis, I admit. It could be, but personally, I think it has little foundation. What do you think? Let me know. It has several weak points as a theory because, in theory, it seems to work, but in reality, it's a different story. There's also another element, the staging. We'll talk about that in the next episode. For now, I'll say goodbye, and thank you for being with me. Share your theories on social media. Have a good night and a hug.